One.
Good morning. Today is Tuesday, August 6, 2024. This is the Arlington County Board of Equalization hearing. We have 4 cases on the agenda, and let the record show that we have 6 members present for a quorum. The first case is RPC 3500402A at 1200 Fern Street South. Mr. Bushel, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about the property, sir.
Sure. The property is known as the Whitmer. The entity that owns it is Pentagon Residential 1. It's a relatively new apartment complex or tower, just a few years old. It's attached to what's been known as Pentagon Center, sort of a retail mall that is anchored by a Costco. You may be familiar with it. The subject property has a small retail component of 6,422 square feet. This just includes, I believe, a Chick-fil-A, a pizza place, and a Chase Bank branch. But there are 440 apartments, and that's obviously most of what we're here about. On page 1 of my presentation, I first take you through a side-by-side with the assessment office and the 2023 actuals, income on the retail portion, the 6,400 square feet. Not to belittle it, there's a difference. We come up with a lower NOI. We think the cap rate doesn't reflect the taxes being loaded in, and it comes to a difference of about $2.5 million in value. The assessment office has about $7,859,000 on the retail. We came up with $5,333,000, and while $2.5 million is nothing to sneeze at, that's really not where I want to focus. That difference to us doesn't, it's not a big deal. The issue is really with the apartment portion, and that's at the bottom of page 1, where I just put the gross potential rent and the other income that was collected in 23 side by side with the assessment office's valuation. You can see we're really close. I mean, for a $12 million NOI, we're 200,000 apart. So there's really no difference there. The difference, again, is what I was here a couple weeks ago about, and that's the cap rate. The assessment office uses a 5.29% cap rate. Now, I say it's not loaded with tax just because I couldn't believe it wasn't, but I think it is considered to be loaded with tax, meaning it's a base rate of about 4.2%. And if that's the case, and the fact of the matter is that just doesn't make sense anymore as of January 1, 2024. Even if you were to look as on top of page 2, I get into a summary of, if you looked at the 10-year treasury now, which was, I think, at 3.95 as of January 1, 2024, and you got Fannie Mae financing, which this property wouldn't get because it's, high end. Even the best lending is going to give you a 1.5 to 1.75 spread on top of that treasury, which means you'd be getting an interest rate of 5.45, and that's before you have any return to the buyer. And to back this up, we've attached a number of surveys. One is the RERC fourth quarter first tier East region. Now that obviously covers a large area, including Virginia, DC, Maryland, and some other states. And that shows an average for the fourth quarter of 2023 of, sorry, I lost my place, of 5.6. Okay, and that's unloaded, meaning the 1.1 roughly tax rate is not added on to that. RERC then does a city by city. I'm sorry, it was 6.5 for the region, excuse me, but without tax. They do produce a Washington, D.C. centric survey that just focuses on the D.C. area. First tier properties for D.C. are 5.6. So still way above anything this 4.2 base that's being used here. And then finally, there's CBRE's second half 2023 multifamily infill for Class A stabilized. This property, I think, is considered stabilized at this point. and it's certainly infill. And the DC area reports a range of 5.25 to 5.75. Um, this, in our discussions last time, I realize the assessment office, when they sat down to do the 2024 assessments, didn't always have this information. This is like one of the fastest increases in rates. They went from near zero in the spring of 2022 to, I think, almost 4 or 5, almost over 4 within a matter of months. And so, no one is criticizing the assessment office for not using this when they sat down in the summer or whenever they sit down and do their reassessment, certainly well before the actual date they're supposed to be valuing the property for. But the reality is, this is what the rates are as of January 1, and that's what someone is entitled in Virginia to have their property valued at as of that date. And that's really the main difference here. So even agreeing to their NOI and capitalizing it at 6.53, we used a rate of 5.5 plus 1.03%. The residential tax rate indicated a value of 189,000 on the apartments. And if we add that to our 5.3, we come up with an overall value for this economic unit of 194,408,000. Again, as I said, keep the 2.5 million on the retail. That's not really our main concern. I just was trying to be thorough and show that to you, but that's the real issue to us. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Chikas.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chikas for the county, please.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, board members. Good morning, Mr. Bushel.
Basically
taking over with that same argument, we've touched on this a couple times this year. The county was not privy to fourth quarter, which of course comes out after the data valuation after January 1. We did rely upon our third quarter surveys, which we've mentioned. PricewaterhouseCoopers third quarter 2023 national apartment market reviews ranges from 3.75 to 8. When they get more specific into the Mid-Atlantic region, they range from 4.25 to 6.5. And the Citus RERC third quarter East investment criteria shows a range from 4.5 to 9.3. Again, we believe that we are covered by that in regards to being on the low end, but this property, I think, makes sense even more so than the last. This is across the street from Pentagon City Metro. As Mr. Bushel noted, this opened, I believe, in 2019, 2020, and had the fastest lease up in Northern Virginia history, reached 95% occupancy in 6 months of lease up. They've continued with that trend. As you can see, I'll rely heavily upon the summary sheet. When we're looking at the property the last 3 years, 5% vacancy in 2021, 4.3% in 2022, and again, 5.3% in 2023. So highly stabilized as far as occupancy. When we look at the metrics,
time is up.
It grew by 5% in 2021, 7.3% in 2022, and another 4% in 2023. As far as net operating income, it increased by 3.4% in 2021, almost 14% in 2022, and again, another almost 5% in 2023. When you compare our numbers to what was achieved, you can see we were very close, within 2.8% of what was achieved for gross potential, within 2.2% of what was achieved for effective gross, and within 1.3% of what was achieved for the NOI. Let's look at what happened last year. This is a very modest 3.1% increase over last year's assessment, which again doesn't even keep pace with the NOI of almost 4.8%. And then we look at the owner's recommendation, which is actually almost a 17% drop year over year. And that's again after almost 5% increase in net operating income. Based on the history of the property, the owner ended up building a new tower just south of this one, which again you would think that would actually be cannibalizing its current operations, but we think that actually speaks to the strength of the market that they were willing to actually put up another apartment just 2 blocks south of this one. Based on the history of the property, based on the increase of net operating income year over year over year, based on the support we've offered for our cap range, we do believe that the county should be confirmed at the revised value of $241,118,900. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Questions from board members? Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, I've got one for each side. For the applicant, what I've always done to convert the county cap rate to the market cap rate that the industry uses is I just add 1. So why wouldn't the cap rate, assuming your argument is accurate, be 6.29?
Well, that's if you use their base rate, which was about, I think you're right. I'm looking at the rate. I would use 1, 2. I was getting mixed up with the commercial rate, which is a little higher, 1.1. But yeah, I think their base rate that they used, they capitalized the income at 5.29. If you subtract 1 from that, it means a base of 4.29. What I did was, I think the 5.29 is a little low. I used 5, but I'd take 4. I mean, we would take a base of 5.29 plus 1, but that's
okay. Chris, let me ask you this question. I agree with everything you've said. This is a spectacular project. And, you know, I know that you all looked at things in the third quarter, but without exception, every single applicant has come up here and said cap rate's wrong. Without it, I think it's without exception, because we just hear it over and over and over. Why didn't the county pause and say, you know what, maybe this time we ought to take a look at that?
Are you referring to doing this post-date evaluation?
No, I'm talking about looking at the fourth quarter, because the applicant just made a good argument that everything was pretty steady until the fourth quarter, when all of a sudden interest rates flew up.
Yes, sir. I think the primary issue is timing. The fourth quarters don't come out in general until after January, early February. The data evaluation is January 1st. With some 3,000 parcels and 4 appraisers, it takes us quite a bit of time to evaluate all of those. So we do start sometime in October, November to be time ready for a quality review, if you will, of the properties that were valued, and then have them out by January 1st. So in other words, there's no way we would be able to retroactively go backwards to January 1 after the data evaluation.
Let me ask you one more quick one. If the interest rates go up, as they have gone up, doesn't that have to increase the cap rate by some amount?
I believe that's taken into account when we look at surveys as well. In other words, those surveys take into account the same information that you're describing. So in other words, holistically, if we're looking at the surveys, they should be taken into account as well.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Okay, other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Chikas, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, ma'am. Again, just in regards to the support that we've offered, that is what we had at the data evaluation. We did not have the fourth quarter information as of the post-data evaluation, but based on the history of the property, its increased year over year over year, its stabilized nature, and its location, we do believe the county should be confirmed at a value of $241,118,900. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bushel, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the timing of when these rates came out, I mean, keep in mind, I submitted the second half 2023 range of Class A stabilized 5.25 to 5.25 to 5.75. The first half, which was definitely available when they did it, was already at 5 to 5.5 for the same kind of property. So, you know, right there in the 5.25 thing. You know, the other thing is the income's been increasing. Well, yeah, the income's been increasing, but the costs to borrow have exploded. So even if the income's going up, doesn't mean the value of a property goes up. I mean, we've seen a ton of appraisals, a ton of broker opinion of value, where people who just paid tens of millions for suburban Maryland, DC, Virginia properties are being told by those same brokers within a 2-year span that their properties lost 30 to 40, or in some cases 50% of value. So the cap rates, no question.
Time is up.
About it. Okay, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's just among the board members now. Where is everybody on this? Mr. Lawson?
Yeah, I'll share my thoughts and see if anyone agrees. You know, as Mr. Chicas pointed out, this is about as good as it gets. And everything he said is accurate. I do, however, think that we can't ignore the interest rates. And so I do think a modest increase in the cap rate should be done here. I don't think I'm necessarily going to get support with that opinion, but I just wanted to share that's kind of where I am.
Okay. Mr. Metzgen?
Yep, I had my own thing, but let me just add on to Barnes for one moment. And that's absolutely true. The interest rates didn't explode in the fourth quarter. They're exploding all year, starting in I think the fourth quarter of the prior year, 2022. And we've talked a lot about this. I think all of our collective feeling is without substantial scientific empirical evidence that the cap rates are too low. And we've also agreed that we're not professionally able to adjust them in midstream like this. So I'm going to just leave that, I hope, for the last time on the table and bring up one minor point. I liked F1 and F2 a lot. I liked Mr. Chicas' description of how they go about things as per usual a lot. I do have one minor nit, and that is in the OpEx for retail, where it's consistently 150 something thousand, all of a sudden it becomes 80,000. So I just ran some numbers and said, no, I think OpEx should be another, precisely, if you wish, well, I'll just say a little over 74,000. And what that does is cap out to a reduction, and I can give you actual numbers, of a reduction overall of the entire project of about 1.1 million. It's certainly not what the appellant's looking for, but the numbers are the numbers, and I feel confident that I'm on solid ground in this regard.
Okay. Other folks? Mr. Penaranda?
Yes, I totally agree with everything that was said, and I totally agree with Ken. That was my only, the only thing that I also noticed that expenses on the retail were maybe a little too low, and I follow the same path. I used 157,000, which was with a revised amount that the county used also for the reconstructed. So by doing that, by increasing to 157 instead of the 80,000, I come up with a final value of 240,078,800. It's about like what Ken said, about $1,100,000 less.
Okay. Mr. Mendez?
Yeah, I would be okay with Jose's number. I did notice that as well. The appellant didn't seem to have an issue with it, but I'd be okay with increasing the op expenses for the
Okay,
retail
Mr.
side.
Yates?
I'll agree with Jose's number, but back to the bigger picture, I think in adjusting cap rates, not having the data when it's needed, the volume and the equalization with other projects, this is something that'll be effective next year with what the new numbers are coming out by the reporting agencies. It's not something we can deal with on this one. It's just not, it's too aggressive, active in the market. And I agree with the appellant on that. But I agree with the county and the fact they cannot be adjusted. It is an active market and equalization is an issue.
Okay. All right,
I
Mr.
second
Penaranda,
that
I
fully.
think you've got the votes, so if you
Well,
want to go.
Sure.
Could that number, Jose, could you repeat that number? I didn't catch it. I'm sorry.
Sure. I mean, that would drop the NOI for the retail to 500,521. So the final value with the apartments would be 240,078,800.
78,800?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I got confused on.
Okay. All right, Mr. Penaranda?
I'll move that we reduce the assessment on this economic unit to 240,078,800 based on increasing the expenses on the retail.
Okay, and
I'll second.
Hold on, I think as Mr. Matskin had done that as well. Do you want to second that, Mr. Matskin?
I second it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. The assessment's reduced to 240,078,800, even based on increasing the retail expenses. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right, I see we have Mr. Peralta. Do we have Mr. Harmon?
Yes, good morning.
Okay, perfect. Moving along to the second case on the agenda, RPC 140130049 at 1100 North Glebe. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about this property, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the board. Good morning, Rob. Good morning. This is 3 Ballston Plaza, located at Glebe Road and Fairfax Drive in Ballston. It was built in 1989 and was 42% vacant as of the date of value, with an additional 35,000 square feet advertised for sublet for only $25 per square foot. To start, I want to point out that the county's assessment only has 94,000 square feet of vacant space at the property, instead of the actual 132,000 square feet of vacant space that was there as of the date of value. Secondly, the county's test column grows the total NLA of the property by 28,000 square feet. This 28,000 square feet is above and beyond anything the property has reported. It simply does not exist at the property. The property is 316,000 square feet, yet the county's test imputes income on over 344,000 square feet of space. This is a significant error that results in a massive increase in value to the test column. Over $9 million in additional value is related to this non-existent space. It appears the county may have double counted the retail space on the test column, which is why the total NLA is 28,000 square feet higher than what the property actually has. You can see on the 2023 INE on page 48 of the appeal, the total area is listed as 316,000 square feet, which matches the rent roll on page 52, as well as the 2021 and 2022 INEs and rent rolls also included in the appeal. So it appears this additional 28,000 square feet of space that income has been attributed to is just a mistake of some sort. Removing this space, again, results in a reduction of over $9 million to the county's test column using their per square foot value. Now, the current assessment is $305 per square foot. The county's test value is $303 per square foot, of course, at the elevated NLA. The appeal value is $221 per square foot. Now, why are the per square foot values important? Well, I mentioned the per square foot values because this property is directly adjacent to 4601 Fairfax Drive, right next door, directly adjacent. 4601 Fairfax sold in an arm's length transaction in August of 2023 for $102 per square foot. Again, the sale comp directly next to the subject sold in an arm's length transaction for $102 per square foot in August of last year. The current assessment for the subject is over $300 per square foot. So how does the subject compare to the sale comp next door? Well, the subject was built in 1989. The sale comp was built in 1986, so they're similar ages. The subject is 42% vacant. The sale comp next door was 40% vacant, so similar occupancies. The subject has Jacobs Engineering as the largest tenant. The sale comp has GSA as its largest tenant, so similar tenant makeups. So these two properties are very similar in age, occupancy, and income. It begs the question, why is the subject assessed as if it is 3 times better than the sales comp next door when they're both similar ages, similar occupancy, similar tenancy? The appeal value is $221 per square foot, still double the sale comp next door, but much more realistic than the assessment's $303 per square foot. So how did the assessment get so high, so far away from the sale comp? Well, there's 4 ways. First, the assessment imputes vacant office space at $38 per square foot, which is too high. After all, this property has 35,000 square feet of space listed as available at $25 per square foot. Now, upon review, the county did correct the vacant office rental rate, but removed any consideration of concessions from the in-place office. This offset the correction to the vacant office rental rate. Removing concessions when concessions have been consistently documented at the property and are known to the county to continue to be incurred is not in accordance with Virginia law. Removing concessions throws the county's test column out of equalization in two ways. First, Virginia law requires assessment methodology be uniform or equalized across properties. For each of the other office properties we have heard on the initial assessment and on the initial assessment for this property, the county recognizes concessions on the top line income as a method of amortizing the effects of concessions to avoid large one-year swings up and down that would result from recognizing concessions as they're incurred. This has been the county's methodology for several years now. Second, Virginia law states that a taxpayer has a right to have the assessment reduced to the percentage of that value at which others are taxed so as to meet the uniformity required by the Virginia Constitution, as well as by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So by removing concessions on the test column, the county throws the valuation out of equalization. The county's aware of this. We've specifically asked the county on multiple occasions if their test columns adhere to assessment methodology. The county does not answer our questions. That silence is telling. So please don't just assume the county's presented a test column that incorporates more recent information. Please ask if that test column does in fact apply the same methodology to the test columns as they do the assessments. We know they do not because the test column removes concessions, which is not equalized under Virginia law. Second, the assessment imputes operating expenses that are not reflective of what properties stabilized at 28% vacancy in the county actually operate at. On page 29 of the board pack, you'll see our analysis of properties we represent in the county that were 28% or less vacant in 2023 and the operating expenses that they incurred for that year. Across these properties, operating expenses averaged $11 per square foot. Third, the county imputes a cap rate based on the sale of the Microsoft building in Roslyn that occurred in February of 2022. The county stated they relied on the local professional study of Peter Korpax. In the study, Korpax noted that the buyer of the Microsoft building paid a premium to purchase the 92% occupied building. Notably, the county has assessed every office in the county based on this one sale from February of 2022 that Korpax himself states is not reflective of a market sale, as the buyer paid a premium to acquire the asset. What the county should have done with the Korpax report, if that's the preferred support for cap rates, is use Korpax's other sale, 1776 Wilson Boulevard, which is much more comparable to the subject. That property had a cap rate of 9.5%. That's right where we're at for this property. Now, I understand the view of acknowledging the county's cap rates are too low, but not knowing what the appropriate adjustment should be. The cap rate that we've proposed is supported by the Korpax report. Our research is also presented across the first 45 pages of the board book. And our conclusion is, again, in line with the Korpax report, but it's also in line with the 2010 county guideline rates. In 2010, the guideline cap rate for this property would have been 9.5%. So I also want to make note here of the Supreme Court of Virginia stating that when fair market value and equalization cannot both be accommodated, fair market value is to be given priority. Finally, the county imputed a DFL assuming the property was only 30% vacant instead of the actual 42% vacancy. In addition to the 28,000 square feet of additional space that doesn't exist at the property, this is how you get the assessment at triple the nearby sales.
Time is
Thank
up.
you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Good morning. Thank you. First off, I would like to state that the square foot is accurate compared to what the appellant has in column G1. The square footage is 315,896, 315,896 square feet. What that does to the DRIA's test is change the overall value, and I would like to present that value to the board after reviewing it just now with respect to that double counting in the retail. So the overall value would be $89,078,400 when we remove that that square footage in retail. And the resulting NOI is similar to what was reported in the column E 2023 INE. So that what you see there is the reported NOI is similar to if you extract out that square footage adjustment, double counting that retail square footage. So that's primarily what I'd like to present is a change in value and a reduction based on the information that Mr. Harmon pointed out this morning. In addition to that, I'd like to speak to the cap rates because we're going to see this, or we're going to see the same argument in later cases. With respect to the cap rate regarding the Corpac study, the ranges that were provided with the Corpac study are our cap rates are within those ranges that were provided by that Corpac study. In addition to that, our cap rates are higher than what was recommended in the Corpac study. If you look at our low end and high end and our range with respect to our 2024 guidelines. In addition to that, I'd like to emphasize that in addition to considering those ranges, the county has increased the vacancy above and beyond what the market has shown to affect the current market of what we see in Arlington. If you look at this particular case, you'll see exactly what I'm speaking of. In the test column, you see that a per square foot rate is that we use is $50.90. When you factor in the vacancy, we're deducting another 28% beyond those rates. So when you look at $50.90 and you reduce that by the 28% vacancy, you come up with a net effective rent of $36.64. When you look at the vacant square footage of $34.20 and you deduct out that vacancy and collections of 28%, you get a net effective rent of $24.62. When you deduct from the square footage that I have there, miscellaneous square footage of $24 a square foot, we're deducting out 28% again, and the net effective rent is $17.28. So we're essentially capping the potential rent of this property at a discount of almost $12 if you add up all the income there that we reduced the projected gross income by, and it's nearly almost $4 million in reductions there based on our methodology and our guidelines. So to say that we don't consider the concessions, as Mr. Harmon pointed out, is not a true statement. It's factored in there. When we test in the majority of our reviews, when we test the income, we do see that the income does increase year over year on the leases in place, and that's due in part by the increases in rent per square foot that are contracted in each of those leases for those leases in place. So we are increasing the rate above what we originally had when we projected the income in the original 2024 assessment. So with that, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions from board members? Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, what I guess for both sides, what's the deal on this note number 4 on the summary sheet about a lease was signed in 2023 for 16? Was that done or not done? Is that accurate or inaccurate?
Which point? I'm sorry.
On note number 4 on the summary sheet down there in the comments, it says CoStar shows a lease was signed for suite. And I can't read it. 1600.
1600.
Yeah,
so
March 8. Is that accurate or inaccurate?
So I note that because that's what I see in CoStar, but I did in fact keep it as vacant in the rent roll.
That was my question. Thank you.
Doesn't Mr. Harmon want to speak on that lease?
I'm looking at the rent roll and I don't see a suite 1600. Let me just
Well,
go. So
Are
I'm
they,
not sure what CoStar is showing and what the note is referring to, but the rent roll on it's 12/31/2023 rent roll that the owner submitted. I don't know if it has a suite 1600, not on the rent roll at least. So I'm not sure what CoStar is referring
well,
to.
the only reason I asked was that often leases are signed and you got a year of free rent or something. That's the only reason I asked it.
Okay, Mr. Penaranda?
Yeah, this is to Mr. Peralta. Could you repeat the new amount that you came up with and how you came up with it?
Right. Okay. Just to speak on Mr. Lawson's or Mr. Harmon's comment, there's a suite 1600 on the rent roll that I see on page 27 of 68. To speak on the change in value, what I did is I removed the $1 million that was associated with that line item. Let me get back to my sheet. Sorry.
Vacant retail?
The vacant retail. And then in addition to that, I subtracted out, I believe this the 267, 145 associated with the vacancy deduction of 28%.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a resulting NOI that was similar to the 2023 INE NOI.
Okay, and what's the final value?
89,078,400.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Matzkin? Your microphone's not on.
No, I got it. Thank you. I was switching screens. First two questions for the appellant. On page 2 of the packet, number 2, operating expenses, you mentioned that in this case, the operating expense is too low, and you defend it, at least in part, by saying that the average of similar buildings is $11 a square foot, whereas the county put in, it says here $9.23, but on the INE, it's $9.25. My question is, are you suggesting that all similar properties should just have an $11 a square foot and not follow the history of the particular property?
That's right, because what is happening with the income is when the county and the appellant impute income, we impute income as if the building is 72% occupied. We don't just take last year's income on a 60% occupied building and say that's what it is. If that is what we did, then we would say, yes, use the actual operating expenses. But because income has grown above and beyond what the property actually achieves, then expenses should also be grown to accommodate that stabilized occupancy.
Good, thank you. Good, cogent answer. Second question, I don't see in columns D or G or G1 and anywhere only a minimal and sometimes no income, actual or potential income for retail. Is that put into rows 1 and 1A and the office?
It is. I'm not sure if there's, this property has, I don't think they have retail. When we inspected this property, this is on the other side. It's on the northwest side of Ballston near the interstate. So it's not really, I don't think they have ground floor retail, and Mr. Peralta can correct me if I'm wrong, but when we inspected it last year, I don't recall any retail being present at this property.
Well, Mr. Peralta, you have potential income for retail of over $1 million. So
I removed that from the analysis or the test.
Yeah.
That's where I came up with the new value that Jose had asked about.
well, I'm looking at it, column F. I'm looking at $1,068,000 plus dollars.
Right. Initially, that was the case. However, after Mr. Harmon pointed out this morning, I did remove that from the test.
Totally. So when that caps out, will that bring it below the original column F valuation and column D evaluation?
Correct.
Or no?
And if I may, there's another correction as well. If you look at the page 5, there's only 25% vacancy taken and not 28%. I think that's, I apologize for not presenting that in the case, but it just ran out of
But it
time.
is shown on the INE, so I mean, it could be a typo, who knows? Okay, so Mr. Peralta, it's the column F test of 104 million plus, when adjusting for that retail or lack of retail, still doesn't come out below the 96 million plus in column D, is that correct?
It does. Again, it's at 89 million.
Oh, okay, that's where that came from. I
78,400.
heard that. Okay, great, 89 million. Okay, you keep that number in mind, please. Thanks. The other question is now for Mr. Harmon, the appellant. Your opening comments focused in a lot on concessions that the county wasn't accounting for them very much. And so I'm looking at my screen and I see that no concessions were mentioned or in columns D or the test or anywhere, only in the operating expenses that the appellant submitted. Was there a relatively minor number of 136,000 plus 137? So given that you spent some good time on it, where again are the concessions supposed to be in order to reduce further the valuation?
So on row 1, the office in-place income, it's traditionally been the county's methodology, as it was on the initial assessment this year for this property, to take typically 10% off that number to account for concessions. And the reason is that concessions, 2 reasons. One, as we'll see in a couple of the later cases, concessions can occur throughout the term of the lease. They're not always up front. So it's to account for concessions that occur throughout the term. It's also to amortize the impact of those concessions. So in the instance where you have a 10-year lease and 1 year free rent, and that 1 year is taken at the front, then obviously income would decrease significantly, and that would result in a much lower assessment. So by amortizing it across the life of the lease, that smooths the effect of when those concessions are occurring.
And just to follow up quickly, the 10% reduction you mentioned, would that be in row 1 or 1A?
That would be in row 1. So on this property, the 2024 assessment initially assessed the property at $44.35 per square foot for in-place office. That's right at where we were. We were at $45.18. So that's accounting for 10% concessions, because
and I see you consistently in G1, G2. Good.
And then the test came back at $51. So they took off that.
And so do you disagree with the test that it's back up? There is no 10% accounting for concessions?
That's correct. And that's what makes it unequalized, non-uniform with other assessments, is that on the initial assessments, the county does account for concessions as we agree they should be. And then when they test it, they take that acknowledgement of concessions away.
Yeah, I heard that. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Lawson?
Yeah, hey, Rob, isn't this building kind of behind other buildings at Front Glebe Road?
Yeah.
It is, isn't it? I also solved the mystery. Apparently a doctor's firm that specializes in cancer is moving into 1600. So I'll share that.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Is everybody comfortable with Mr. Peralta's numbers, the adjustments? Okay, all right, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up. Oh,
Thank you.
wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Maskin, your hand is up. Your microphone.
Only because I forgot to take it down.
Okay, all right, Mr. Peralta, take a minute to wrap up then, please.
Yes, thank you. In lieu of the changes made just this morning, I do move to ask the board to change the assessment to 89,078,400, and that's in just removing that portion that was overcounted I would like to add that if there's any issue with respect to that number, that Mr. Lawson's and my research of the 1600 suite would essentially take off the below the line deductions by that amount that was leased as of the 2023 lease that I noted that was signed in May 8th of 2023. I'm sorry, March 8th of 2023, and that's 16,783 square feet. But don't want to muddy the water more than it is. I would just revert to that new value that I just pointed out. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, thank you. This property is right next to a property that sold for $100 a square foot. Very similar, same age, same tenancy, very similar comp. Current assessment's over $300 for this property. We request that the test column account for concessions as the initial assessment did, as the assessments for other properties do. That's required by uniformity and equalization. Request that expenses be grown. Right now, they're reflective of a property that's operating at less than 60% occupancy. Request that those operating expenses be grown to reflect a property operating at 72% occupancy, which is what has happened for the income. Cap rate, the Corpax range is really two sales. It's the Microsoft sale and 1776 Wilson. That makes up the range. Microsoft sale 7.25, 1776 is at 9.5. This property is much more similar to 1776 than it is to the Microsoft building. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. It's just among the board members. So where's everybody on this? Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, let me ask my colleagues, didn't we kind of have a policy, or didn't we once or twice up the cap rate by 0.5% if it was over 40% vacant? Is that my recollection, or am I wrong on that?
I don't recall doing that.
I don't think so.
I seem to recall us increasing the cap rate once or twice, maybe last year, but I don't remember the circumstances.
Yeah, I thought we did. Yeah.
Situations, but it wasn't a uniform.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Mr. Penranda.
Well, I'm okay with the new amount that the new value that Mr. Peralta came up with, considering that the space that is in question is already rented and not being really considered, which would bring the value a little bit higher. So I'm okay with the 89,078,400.
All right, Mr. Yates.
And that I think that also addresses some of the difference in expenses too that were brought up.
All right, Mr. Mendez, anything different?
I'd agree with the new number.
All right. Would somebody like to make a motion then?
No, I have my hand up, Mary, excuse me.
I don't see it, but go ahead.
Oh, I clicked react, not raise. I'm sorry. I'm not a good icon guy. I wanted to introduce something to us, and that is, I thought the operating expenses argument, given that this is was relevant in this case. And I don't know that it should be 11 because the average is 11 as proposed by the appellant. But I mean, this is a significantly vacant building, and we're supposed to, and this has come up over the years many times. This is nothing brand new, that we ought to account for a 90 or 95% building and what those expenses might be. So I took from the appellant's pro forma an expense of $10.50. And the bottom line is that it reduces the 89 million plus by about $5.5. I can give you specific numbers, of course, by a little over $5.5 million, capping out that higher OpEx. I want to know if anybody took that as seriously as I did.
You know, the leaving out that vacant
Mr. Yates?
space, I'm sorry, leaving out that vacant space, doesn't that I saw that as taking that into account and also dealing with the expenses a little bit.
How did they deal with the expenses?
The adjustment by not counting, adding in what is that lease space. It's not adding that back into the expenses. I mean,
Keep going. I'm not following. I'm sorry.
the
It
county,
seems like- Go
the
ahead.
county adjusted, it did not adjust further for the space that is leased that was not showing up. Therefore, they've left that as a vacant area, and therefore their calculations on expenses were not including that additional space.
That tenant wasn't occupying as of the
I'm
first.
sorry, Mr. Harmon,
Okay.
it's just among the board.
Yeah, I think in my opinion, it compensates for, not considering that that space is already leased. So
Yeah,
I'm okay with the amount the way it is.
that's one. It's taking it, yeah, it's considering it.
But it might not be paying rent. It may be leased, but not yet paying rent. I don't know what the circumstances of the deal are. And the sheet that the applicant presented shows a lease signed March 8, Suite 1600. The amount of the square footage, but zero. It doesn't show any rent coming in yet.
Right, but that's March of 2023.
Yeah,
So even if they didn't
Okay.
pay for a year, you got that already factored in there. I mean, I'm kind of with Jose. I mean, this is a 10%, a $10 million drop. I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah, I really think the cap rate ought to change. But I know that my colleagues aren't going there. And I think Ken does have a point that if you're going to assume the building's fully leased for the income, then you got to assume it's fully leased for the expense.
All right, Mr. Mendez?
I'm still sticking with the county's number. I think they did a good job adjusting on the fly.
Okay, I don't want to have a motion and then have it revert back to the original county. So
I'm with
I
the county.
think we're set then. All right, Mr. Penaranda?
Sure, I'll move we reduce the assessment to the new value of 89,078,400.
second.
Okay, so we have a motion, a second by Mr. Yates. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? So, Mr. Matzkin, I assume you're opposed?
Opposed, I click
Okay.
the right icon, raise.
Okay, so the assessments reduced to the new county's recommended assessment of 89,078,400. Thank you. Okay, same players, RPC number 34020-029 at 2521 South Clark Street. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes on this property.
Yes, thank you. So to start, I want to address the county's first two comments on the review. First, the county states no rent rolls have been provided since 2020. However, you can see that the 1/1/23 rent roll is in the board pack. That's on pages 24 through 26. No rent roll was requested either. The second comment, this is really the big one. The second comment states that GSA has renewed their lease at this property. This is not true. GSA has not renewed their lease and has in fact told the owner that they do not intend to renew the space as it won't be needed. This is a pretty egregious assumption to make on the county's part that GSA has resigned when in fact GSA has said we're not resigning. We don't need the space. It would have been great if the county had asked about this renewal, but we had no indication that this assumption was being made. The county seems to have assumed this, as you can see in that comment, because concessions were reported in 2022. The county assumes that those concessions were related to a lease renewal. However, as the board may recall, we did hear this property last fall. In that hearing, we addressed that $5.5 million in concessions. That 5.5 million in concessions reported in 2022 were related to excess tenant improvements from the initial lease that the tenant hadn't used and instead elected to receive as free rent at the end of their lease. So, that's changes the paradigm of how you look at this property quite a bit. The county's assessing it as if GSA just renewed and the concessions have already been incurred, when in fact, GSA has said they're moving out. So this property goes from 100% leased with GSA to 100% vacant, former GSA space, which is typically in a little bit of rough condition once they leave. Now that 5.5 million in concessions was addressed at last year's hearing. The county knew about that. Clearly the value will be vastly different for a 100% occupied building versus a 100% vacant building. As we saw in the last case, if the county wants to consider leases signed but not commenced as of the date of value as occupying, then we also need to consider the opposite, the reverse, when tenants are known to be leaving but haven't left yet. Now, this concessions, I wanted to touch on that as well. This is a great example of why the county adopted the methodology of deducting concessions on an amortized basis. As you look at the operating history of the property on page 3 of the pack, you'll see on columns C and E, which represent operating years 2022 and 2023, that the property incurred, again, 5.5 million in concessions in 2022 and over 1.1 million in concessions in 2023. These are related to the initial lease that began back in the mid-2010s. Compare this with the assessment history of the property shown on page 6. You'll notice for tax years 2022 and 2023, the assessments actually increased. If concessions were considered for these years, the value would have drastically and dramatically decreased and then shot back up the following year. So that's the whole rationale behind amortizing concessions across the life of the lease. It's to smooth those one-year fluctuations. So for this reason, and based on sales in the county that have shown sales prices do reflect the impact of concessions, the county, again, has adopted that methodology of reducing rental income, top-line rental income by a flat percent to mitigate these large swings up and down in assessed values from year to year. In years past, the county reduced rental income by 8% to reflect concessions that were being offered in the market. Then last year, as it was clear concessions in the market had fundamentally shifted higher, the county began to deduct 10% for uniform concessions. This again has the effect of amortizing concessions across the life of the lease. It's worth noting, again, many leases spread concessions throughout the life of the lease, as has happened at this property. Now, at this property, you can see signed their lease in 2015 and incurred 6.5 million in concessions, which were TI converted to free rent. They incurred that in years 2022 and 2023. No buyer would ignore the impact of these outstanding concessions. So if you're a buyer as of January 1 and you know that it has these outstanding concessions, you're going to consider them and factor them into your value, especially if you know GSA has not re-signed and GSA does not need the space. Applying the county's uniform, equalized methodology of accounting for concessions by amortizing them for a 10% deduction to the subject results in a rental rate of $36 per square foot for in-place office. Next, the county, again, the cap rate. This is not reflective of the market. We know based on market sales, the county guidelines have overassessed the majority, if not all, office properties in the county. We spoke about 4601 Fairfax in the last case. That property sold for $25 million in August of last year. The 2024 assessment for that property, using the county guidelines, is over $40 million, or 63% higher than that August 2023 sale price. Next, as we've seen the county include 2024 sales in their presentations to the board, we should also consider 2024 sales for offices. 1616 North Fort Myers sold on January 4th of this year, just 3 days after the assessment's date of value. That property sold the improvements for $25 million. The 2024 assessment valuing that property 3 days prior to the close date valued the improvements at $30.6 million, or 23% higher than the sale price. Next, 1201 Wilson sold on February 14th of this year for $339 million. The 2024 assessment for that property is $373 million, 10% higher than the sale price. Now, 1201 is interesting too, because that's a 98% occupied property. That's one of the trophy properties in the county. And yet the assessment was still off by $34 million. We provided the cap rate analysis applicable to that sale of 1201 Wilson in the Wilkes Artist Board Book, and it shows that the county's guideline cap rates as applied to that property are off by about 150 basis points. So if the county guidelines overassess even the best building with only 2% vacancy, what chance do the rest of the assessments in the county have of being accurate? Knowing this property was built in 1970 and is likely to go completely vacant in a year, is it really appropriate to apply a cap rate that was built based on the February 2022 sale of the Microsoft building in Roslyn, as the county guidelines have done? Remember too, the sale of 4601 Fairfax, that's a 1986 building compared to this 1970 building. That property sold last year for $102 per square foot. This property is assessed at nearly 4 times as much. It's assessed at $382 per square foot and is about to go completely vacant. The cap rate we have proposed is based on hundreds of hours of research. It's market sales, paired sales, investor surveys, the Corpax report, band of investment analysis, and econometric evidence. Our conclusion is conservative. In 2010, the county guidelines would have valued this property at 10.25% cap rate. So we've imputed a cap rate below that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Yes, good morning. For this case, we have a GSA tenant in the building that has leased this property since 2015. And the stabilized history of the property speaks to exactly the valuation that we have on the property. We look at the overall history from 2020 to 2023. We do see that the rent that they're paying in the rent roll that was provided, as Mr. Harmon pointed out, is at $39, upwards of $39. Originally, the original assessment was at $38.50. If you look at the reconstruction E1, column E1, you can see that the value that was reported is similar to the appellant's per square foot rate. Where the reconstruction is at $36.46. Reminding you again that the contract rent is at upwards of $39 a square foot. So to say that we're not considering the I guess the concessions that Mr. Harmon keeps pointing out is inconsistent. When you know, I opted not to test, just given the reconstruction of the original I&E. The original I&E had a net operating income well above almost 1.8, 1.9 million more than what the original assessment had. And we valued it at 1.8 million less, or than what was reported in the 2023 I&E column E. But then when you reconstruct, I mean, the amounts are somewhat similar. We do add another percent based on the vacancy guidelines. So at best, any property that's 100% occupied in the county will be at a reduced income of 8% due to our guidelines. Because that's the minimum we afford. Last year was again 5%, and this year we increased it by 3% with each category. Now, with respect to expenses, what we did see, and you know, what I didn't have a chance to speak to in the last case is at 7% vacancy in the last case, the expenses were at $7 a square foot. When you look at this property here, you can see that, you know, it's only increased $1 over the years. And in fact, in this year's 2023 or last year's 2023 I&E, it decreased from previous years. And this is a 100% occupied building. So that kind of shows or illustrates, you know, the inaccuracy that, as Mr. Harmon states, that due to inflation, that there is almost a 100% chance that it will increase year over year. That's not the case in this particular property. It actually decreased, and we captured that in the retest. I'm sorry, in the reconstruction, where you can see the affected NOI resulting after we reverted or decreased the expenses that we overstated in the original assessment. In the original assessment, we had 7.75, allotted 7.75 for based on what the previous years had stated. But as you see, in the most recent history, it actually decreased. With respect to the overall income, I mean, this is a stabilized property. We don't know what might happen. I mean, this GSA tenant has a lease that expires in 2025 of next year, late 2025, and they'll still be receiving the income that has been in the contract. So to that effect, we do ask that the board confirm the original assessment at 134,923,000. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Questions from board members? Mr. Mendez.
Yeah, for the appellant, could you please confirm when the tenant is going to vacate?
Yes, their lease expires at mid-September of 2025, September 14th.
Thank you.
Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, how does GSA tell you they're not going to renew? Is it in writing? Is it an oral conversation? How does that happen?
So there hasn't been anything in writing to my knowledge. I believe it's all been conversations with on-site management and ownership.
Does GSA sometimes condemn additional time?
I'm sure it happens. I can't speak to it precisely, but they're a large enough operation that I'm sure it happens.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Thank you. With other properties that have huge tenants leaving, we do see, and we have seen that was provided by the appellant and the owners, just that they put it in writing to speak to Mr. Lawson's comments. And with this GSA tenant, I believe I've seen other leases where they have a certain time period to act. So they have to tell the owners yay or nay if they're renewing the lease or not. And I think it's a minimum of a year in advance of when the original lease expires. So I didn't see that provided in this case. And I wouldn't be surprised if they renew the lease upon expiration. With that, I do ask that the board confirm this case as originally assessed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. So the default when leases expire is they expire. You don't have to tell them in writing. It's in the contract language. If you do not act on this, it ends, both parties go their ways. That's what's occurring here. The proactive assumption that you have to do is if you want to renew. That's what Mr. Peralta is speaking to. To date, the tenant has not given any indication that they're going to renew. They don't have to give anything in writing if they want to leave. It just expires. That's how it works. This property, again, it is 100% occupied, but the 8% vacancy is not something that the DREA gives the property. That's required by law. They have to do that. Think about this property in a couple of years, if and when it goes dark. Are they going to give it 100% vacancy? Of course not. They're going to impute income as if it's 72% occupied, even though it's 0% occupied. So it swings both ways. That 8% is required by law. It's not something the DREA does out of the goodness of their hearts. Concessions should be considered in this case since they've been over $6 million over the past 2 years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Questions? I'm sorry.
We're at our discussion now, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'd like to discuss.
I just want to keep going. Okay, so it's just among the board. Mr. Metzger.
Yeah, I'm ignoring this, whether GSA is coming or going. If I was so good at seeing the future, I wouldn't be on the BOE. I just bet on Super Bowl. So I don't care about that. And I know you don't either. But I do care about two things. One is in column E1, where the reconstruction, which I thought was pretty good and based on more modern information, and it's what the department does, and it's to me welcome. I, however, see between columns D and E1, the E1 column 1 office was reduced per square foot, but the total amount for the same exact amount of square foot, 353,000 plus, but the total dollar value went up to 14 million plus. And in my calculator, it tells me it should have gone down to 12,800,000 plus. So if anybody disagrees, their calculators say something different, but to me, a lower square foot rent on the same amount of square feet produces a lower total amount of income. Again, row 1. So I reduced it, and I can give you specific numbers. So I reduced it. And then I also looked at the operating expenses, and to say that there should be appropriately exactly the same, and Mr. Peralta brought this up, certainly as a pre-defense, that they ought to be exactly the same what was achieved last year, I don't find compelling. There's a trend here at over $8, and who knows, they got lucky, or who knows what happened in 2023. And I thought it should go up, but not egregiously, and maybe not even to the average over the last 4 years. But I just took the column G1 amount of $7.39 and per square foot, and therefore increased the operating expenses. This is again all on the reconstructed. So decreasing the income and increasing the operating expenses brought down the overall amount to about 130 million and a half. 130,665 to 300. Anybody want to discuss that or comment or ignore? Thank you.
Yeah, I just would, could you clarify what you use for expenses?
$7.39 a square foot from column G1, 2,613,000, etc. So it increased expenses by $941,038.
And what was the final amount? I'm sorry.
The final bottom line.
Expenses. No, of the expenses.
Expenses. I'm looking. Well, I guess I didn't do it. I just went directly to paper, but I can tell you in a moment. Oh no, final bottom line on expenses is $2,613,818 directly out of G1.
Okay.
It's much less than the historical expenses, but a little bit more than what they experienced in 2023.
Right. Okay, Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, my daughter happens to do nothing but lease to GSA, and she tells me that they're waiting till the election, and then they're going to start making decisions. So that may be why there's nothing formal. I did very similar to Ken. What I did is I just took the bottom line of G1, which is the applicant's figures, and then applied the county cap rate. And I was very close to what Ken came up with. I got 130,231,800. But I think maybe the way Ken did is a little more justified.
Okay. Other folks? Mr. Mendez?
Ken, can I ask why you use that rental rate? Because I seem to recall Mr. Peralta saying that there was $39 a square foot on the rent roll.
Oh, to allow for the smoothing of concessions. And again, it's what he, after getting more information, chose as a rent rate. So I'm going with the department's rationale on this. Okay.
So you took the 3631 and use the 3646
Where are you, Mary?
on the income.
E1, line 1.
On
E1.
line 1, I took not the 14 million, where is it? 14 million point one or so, but just multiplied $36.46.
Right, you got 12,893, 386.
Exactly. So I decreased the EGI by that, and then increased the OPEX by $941,038, and then capped it all.
I see. All right, Mr. Penaranda.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just doing the calculations that Ken had brought up.
Always
But
appropriate.
the number that I used in the number of 3646 on that reconstructed number, yeah, I do come up with a different value of 12,893, 386, and then just following up with the same expense, I mean vacancy at 8%, and by using the expenses that were originally used by Mr. Peralta of 7 3/4, I come up with a final value of 128,934,400.
Yeah, because the GPI is lower, and I didn't account for, therefore, a lower vacancy. And you did, and I've made that mistake before, and you've caught it before. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So you had the 12,893, 386. Then you brought everything else down and then used expenses at what rate? 775?
Right. I mean, the vacancy would drop a little bit because, I mean, I use the 8%, so that makes a difference also. And then I use the expenses that at 7 3/4.
Oh, 3/4.
Yeah, the original.
The original.
So the what is it? The vacancy number shrunk a little bit. Row 1 shrunk a little bit, and OPEX went way up, and that's where you get the difference. Okay, well,
Right.
way up relative to mine. Okay, yeah, I would support that.
You can support that?
Yeah, I mean, I just took, because the pro forma from the appellant was $7.39. There's no reason to believe it wouldn't be $7.75, because again, it's below the average. No, it's about equal to the average. Either one. I just didn't want to go whole hog on operating expenses, given how well they did last year.
I like Ken's rationale of using the appellant's number for the op expenses. I would support that one, the $130 million number that he had.
Yeah, we have to adjust though for the little bit shrinkage in the vacancy allowance.
Right. So Jose, if you just adjusted your number from the 775 to 739, which is a combination of what everybody's agreeing to.
Yes.
It'll be somewhere between your 128.9 and Ken's 136, 13600.
I'm sorry, which number? Say that again?
If you do your expenses at $7.39 as opposed to $7.75, you should be somewhere between your original number of 128.9 and Ken's 130 million.6.
That's exactly right.
Which I think everybody could probably live with a little bit better.
Yeah. So if you could, Jose, plug in the 2,613,818. Thank you, Mary.
Oh.
Can on a GSA lease like this, do they do some of their own maintenance?
Yes, that's probably why this is traditionally lower than a similar. That's absolutely correct. It's not relevant here, but it's generically, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
See, your daughter made you smarter than you look.
Yeah, I come up with 130,502,039 dollars.
Okay, can you live with that?
Yeah, I'm okay
Yeah,
with that.
Mr. Mendez,
Yes.
Yates, okay, all right. We've got a number. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll move that we reduce the assessment to 130,502 even.
A second.
Okay. Who second?
I did.
Mr. Lawson. Okay, we've got a motion and a second by Mr. Lawson to reduce. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. It's reduced to 130,502,000 even, based on correcting the county error on the rent on the test column and then adjusting the expenses back to 739, which was what was reported by the appellant. Okay, so that completes that. And then the final case is RPC 34020031, 2530 Crystal Drive. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes on this.
Yes, thank you. So 2530 Crystal Drive, this is adjacent to the prior property we spoke about. This building was built in 1971 and is also a GSA occupied building. The current assessment on this property is $378 per square foot. The issues for this property are the same as the prior property, applying the county's equalized concessions methodology and the cap rate. For concessions, the owner of this property is legally bound as of the date of value to spend $3.3 million in concessions. The assessment makes no consideration of these outstanding concessions. This is not how a potential purchaser would value the property as of January 1st. We've seen on numerous settlement statements that the sale price is typically adjusted downwards to account for outstanding concessions. Any buyer, as of the date of value, would inherit the current owner's obligation to spend this $3.3 million in concessions, and as such, it does need to be accounted for in the assessment. Typically, the county accounts for concessions by making a deduction to the top line income. In past years, it was an 8% deduction. Starting last year, as concessions increased, it changed to a 10% deduction. The reason for this, again, is to amortize the impact of concessions across the life of the lease. Our pro forma column on G1 applies the county's uniform, equalized 10% concession methodology to the income to arrive at a per square foot rental rate of $35.34 per square foot. For the cap rate, the same arguments as the last case apply. The county has based their cap rate on the sale of the Microsoft building in Roslyn, which occurred in February of 2022. February of 2022, of course, is important. That's right before the Fed began to aggressively hike interest rates. Now, keep in mind the cap rate for this sale, the Microsoft building listed in the Corpax report, is based on what one anonymous individual told Corpax they thought it was. So it's likely derived from, and Corpax asked, he says in his report, he asked buyers, sellers, and brokers. Typically, he gets a hold of brokers. How do we know this? When you read the comments in Corpax reports, you'll see comments from his contact. And on the sales that he lists, oftentimes the comments are verbatim for multiple sales. When you look at those multiple sales and you say, okay, are the buyers or sellers any of those common parties to each of these transactions? You see that they aren't. So who is a common party to these transactions? It's the brokers. So what Corpax bases his range on is a conversation with one individual about a February 2022 sale of the Microsoft building where a premium was paid before any interest rate hikes. He then goes back to that one individual, unnamed again, and asks him, okay, that February 2022 sale that you had some knowledge of, what would the cap rate be on that as of January 1, 2024? This is not very scientific. I mean, this methodology is, Corpax calls it proprietary methodology. It's also not adopted by any of the professional appraisal practices. You don't see this as an accepted methodology. It's only Corpax who uses it. Now, if the county does like the Corpax report, because as I've stated, it's a local report, then we should at least look at the report in its totality, understand what the cap rates are indicative of, and choose the correct sale that Corpax cites. So his range that he cites is actually two sales. It's the low end of the range is that Microsoft sale from February of 2022. The high end of the range is based on 1776 Wilson, which was an October of 2022 sale. You also need to make adjustments to Corpax's range that he lists in his executive summary as his conclusion. He states in his report that you have to make a adjustment for the tax rate. So we need to add the tax rate to his conclusion. He also states that real estate tax income, this is income that the owner receives from tenants to compensate for real estate taxes. Corpax states that should not be included in NOI when utilizing his cap rates. The county's methodology does include this income, so another adjustment is necessary. In order to get an apples to apples comparison, we have to adjust for both the tax rate, we have to add that on, then we have to make an adjustment for real estate tax income that Corpax says shouldn't be included, yet the county's methodology does include. Applying both of those adjustments to Corpax's conclusions and knowing that his conclusions are two sales, the Microsoft building and 1776 Wilson, we see that the range goes up to 7.25% to 9.5%. And of that range, again, it's two sales. The more appropriate, the more comparable property is 1776 Wilson. Even then, it's not that comparable. That's a 2012 build. It was 85% occupied at time of sale. It's in a little bit nicer neighborhood. This is a 1971 building. It's got significant outstanding concessions. It's had a GSA tenant in there. But even with 1776, the other sale that Corpax uses, the cap rate in his study comes out to 9.5%. Now you can see in our pro forma on column G1 that we've applied a cap rate right around what Corpax concludes for 1776 Wilson. Our proposed cap rate for this property is even below that at 9.4%. Again, 1776 Wilson, it's a 2012 build versus 1971 for the subject. 1776 Wilson was also 85% leased as sale. Our proposed cap rate also happens to be well below the county's guideline cap rates in 2010. 2010, of course, was the last time the office market saw a significant downturn. The 2010 Arlington County guideline cap rate for this property was 10.25%, where our cap rate proposed is only 9.4%. Evidence has shown that this downturn is worse than the downturn in 2010. In 2010, it was a financial downturn. Now we're facing a financial downturn in addition to a systematic rethinking of the need for office space. 1971 buildings such as the subject will likely be functionally obsolete if they're not occupied. Again, the 2010 guideline cap rate for this property, 10.25%, we're imputing 9.4% based on econometric evidence, sales, Corpax report. Again, we're relying on the Corpax report as the county said is their preferred study, but we have to use the correct sale of the two sales. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Thank you. For this property, again, it's a GSA tenant, it's 100% occupied. It's stabilized. We have the original assessment about 1.8 million lower than what they reported in 2023. It's a top tier tenant. Any property would be happy to have the GSA tenant in place for the long term that it has had for the property. Again, with our guidelines, 8% reduces the actual income of the property to what you see in the reconstructed column F. You see that the NOI is actually higher in the reconstructed column than the original assessment, as well as the original NOI that was reported in 2023. The appellant believes that the property can only achieve, I believe, 3 million less than what is reported in the NOI that in 2023. That is, kind of far off from what has been shown in the previous histories of this property. Again, this property is 100% occupied. And with respect to the Corpac study and the fact that Mr. Harmon keeps pointing out that the county is only hanging our hat on one sale, that's inaccurate. We look at the Corpac study. The Corpac study comprises many different sales, of which in 2023, the sales that the majority of the sales were redevelopment sales, and they're going in a different direction as far as conversions from office to apartment. We did see that Corpac's brought in other jurisdictions to get a full market study of what's happening in the current office market. We do see that there were sales that were used in the previous years and time adjusted. And so there is well-rounded study, and we didn't hang our hat just on that. Again, we went above and beyond what we found, and that range again. The low was, if you load the Corpac study, we're at 6.91 for the low end, and the high end is 9.16 loaded. Our county guidelines are 7.05 at the low and 9.750 at the high in our range. That's a difference in the range, in a top tier range of 59 basis points. So we're within range, and we went again above and beyond and reduced the amount of vacancy. Increased the amount of vacancy overall across all properties. You see, this property is afforded 8% beyond what they're reporting. They're at 0% vacancy. So we do ask that the board confirm this case based on the information I provided. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? No? All right, any final comments, Mr. Peralta?
No.
Okay, any final comments in your last minute, Mr. Harmon?
Yes, thank you. So we see at this property, there's $3.3 million in outstanding concessions as of the first of the year. Those do need to be accounted for. We chose to use the county's methodology of deducting that from the top line. Now, as far as the county's statement that, this property, this property is currently assessed at $378 a foot. We've seen properties with GSA tenants sell for $102 a foot. This is largely the result of cap rates being way too low, well below the market. Corpac's report, I believe the board has been provided a copy. The county stated that you have pages 75 and 76. You can see all the sales he used. He did do a study for Fairfax and Arlington, so that's where those came from. But his range for Arlington comes from 2 sales. You can see those on 75 and 76. What the impact of a cap rate that's too low is, even if you assess an NOI that is at or below actual, you're still going to miss the market. We saw this at 1201 Wilson. We saw this at 1616 Fort Myer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. All right, it's just among the board members. Where's everybody on this? Mr. Penaranda?
I have no issues with the assessment the way it is. The NOI is lower than anything else has been in the past few years, even 2023. And being a stable building, a reduction from last year of $38 million, I think it shows that the numbers are correct.
Okay, Mr. Mendez?
I thought the expenses were a little bit low. It looks like historically it's about $7. So I just used the appellant's number of 711, and I got something very close to the revised number. I got 209 million and 180,700.
All right, Mr. Matzkin?
Yeah, I started out doing exactly what Johnny did, but I picked the column G1 number, $7.11. It came out with a a valuation of $15,000 less. I mean, it's not noticeable or notable. But then I looked at, based on the appellant's discussion or revisiting of the concessions, and that's what I wanted to talk to us about. We see over and over again the concessions are reflected in a lower per square foot rent rate generally, and we don't see it here. We see the reconstructed rent rate is exactly what was reported by the appellant for 2023. And I was wondering if we ought to reduce that dollar amount of 22 million plus to reduce it by 3 million, just rounding it off. The concessions that we're told by the appellant was higher than that, but down to 19 million plus. And I was just then doing my homework to then see how that would affect the vacancy number. It would reduce it from 1,700,000 to a little bit less, and I haven't gotten there yet. And then kept that out, and it would probably come out to, well, I can, come out to 208 million or something. I could do the work while we continue talking if there's support for that approach.
Okay, well, just to the issue on the operating expenses, I mean, I'm fine with the reconstructed. I mean, the dollar amount, is right in line with what was reported. I mean, am I reading something
I'm
wrong?
okay. I'm okay with the amount that the county is using, stabilize 8% of the vacancy and concessions. I don't, like I said, I'm not supporting any change to the assessment.
On the expenses, I went back and looked at a bunch of other cases that we heard, and what I looked at was the where it had E07, 08, 09, all the way to E17. And that originally struck me as very high. But when I went back, and I've seen it all over the place, I have seen some examples where it was very close to this figure. And then I saw somewhere it's like 200,000. So I don't know. I guess the building's getting old and they need a lot of repairs, because that's a lot of money to be spending on elevator repairs, common area repairs, plumbing, but it does seem consistent with some other cases.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mr. Yates.
I was looking at adjusting the expenses, trying to calculate that again, but it's fairly consistent with it is consistent with what they reported.
Right.
I can't. It's minor, at best.
Right, and I think for the little bit that they're under for the GPI, it offsets it. So I'm fine.
Right.
With
Exactly.
If you're going to make adjustments, then when you look at the test, it actually increases it. So I'm fine with the original. So, Mr. Metzger.
Thanks. Just wanted to again repeat: is there any reaction to the accounting for concessions or not? Somebody address that.
That would knock the income down by how much, Ken?
I said, well, I just said 3 million. I just took a round number that's a little bit less than what the appellant has reported, and then knock down the vacancy and a little bit, less income, less value for vacancy.
And what's your final value?
Yeah, I'm looking. What I had, where is it? The
2.9
GI would be, again, this is from CalMEP. The EGI would be 20 million, 19,700,000. Would be 18,865,600.
And what's your NOI?
Yeah, that's where I hadn't gotten, but I was rushing to do it, so we didn't run out of conversation. So that I can do that right now. Hold on, the wrong calculator. Sorry. 18. I'm almost there. And I'm ignoring I'm just accepting all the costs. Okay, so the oh God, did something wrong. I'm sorry. Okay, minus. Good, okay. Oh, so the NOI is 17,100,632, capped at 8.093. Is a value of 191,496,400.
Say
I'm
that
sorry,
again.
your NOI was what?
The NOI was 17,100,632, which is almost exactly the same as column F.
Yeah,
How can that be?
If you come up with that NOI, the value would increase to 211,379,000.
Right, you got a mistake on the last calculation, because if you just look at the original assessment at 17,048, capped at 809, it's 210. So there's no way it could be 190. So I think you've got a math error, and I think we're in the weeds.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, just capping out 3 million is serious money, but it's a little less than 3 million because the vacancy is a little bit less. That's what so I got 188,656.
Ken, I tried to follow what you were doing. I ended up at like 186,623,000.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with that.
well,
I keep doing it over and over. Again, the GPI is 19,705,705, and I then multiply that by 8% and got 18 million. I reduced it by 157,000, 8% of 19,157,632, and 18, and therefore got a remainder of 18,865,600, and kept that at 8.093%. And I come out with a strange number, 18 million, unless I'm typoing, 65600 divided by, I'm doing this for the last time, 0893, come out 211 million.
Right, it's because you've ended up with a higher NOI.
Yeah.
No, that's impossible. It's an impossible number because my NOI is lower.
Your NOI should be at around, if I follow what you're suggesting, your NOI should be around 15 million.
Yes, it should. 865,600.
Well, I can tell you, I'm not comfortable
I'm
with
sorry.
the $15 million NOI. I don't know.
just
Mark?
following the progression of the NOI over the
There it is.
time and
1505,
I'm fine with it.
486.
All right, so you're fine with it. Jose, you're fine with it.
I'm fine with it, yeah.
Mr. Mendez, you're fine with it.
I come up with, I apologize. So I'll come up with 168,930,400.
Well, to be honest, whatever number you come up with, you don't have any support for. So you can keep doing
Okay,
your numbers, but we're gonna move forward. Would somebody like to
It's
make
all
a
about the
motion?
concessions and you want to ignore it. That's up to you. That's fine. That's what I was asking.
All right, then I'll make the motion. See here. Gotta get back up there. Okay, so I will move to confirm the county at 210,735,100. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, motion and a second by Mr. Penaranda. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Ken, are you yes or no?
I've raised my hand. My numbers are wrong, but I think my logic is right. So I am opposed.
Okay, so it is 5-1 without Mr. Madskin. The assessment's confirmed at 210,735,100. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. That completes the agenda. I do have one other piece of business. Having voted on the prevailing side of RPC 340202234, I'd like to motion to recall the case. Do I have a second to do that?
I'm sorry, say that the RPC again?
340202234, 2121 Crystal Drive. We heard it on July 16th.
Okay, yes.
Do I have a second?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay, Mr. Penaranda, all in favor to recall it? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. Okay, that the reason we talked about this last week, due to the fact that some information wasn't presented properly to the board in the case. I'm going to recall the case and redocket it for the second slot on Tuesday, August 20th. So I don't think we have to vote on that, do we, Mr. Penaranda?
No, not on the date. No.
Okay, all right. Okay, so Rosa, so that goes into slot 2.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right, so that completes all the business I have. Does anybody else have anything?
No.
No, okay, all right, then we will stand adjourned at 10:47, reconvene tomorrow, August 7th, in person for the board at 9 a.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Okay.